Over the past 30 years, fax has evolved from a physical fax machine to physical fax servers to virtual fax servers, and now fax is moving to the cloud. Installing a fax server in the cloud is very straightforward, but you still need a connection to the PSTN. For most organizations, moving that connection to the cloud is the most complex part of the migration. We're going to dive into the options you have when choosing a cloud-based telephony provider and how to make the best decision for your organization. When choosing a cloud-based telephony carrier, it is important to choose a company that specializes in fax transmissions over SIP, also known as fax over IP or VoIP. Does your voice over IP provider support the proper protocols needed for fax? Do they have expertise with fax over IP? And do they have large enterprises successfully running VoIP on their network? As I briefly mentioned during the previous slide, fax is constantly evolving. Let's dive a little deeper into this evolution of fax. It started with local fax boards. RightFax servers relied on physical fax cards tied directly to T1 or analog lines. It was reliable, but you needed on-site hardware with physical slots for the fax boards and a physical line for either a digital T1 connection or an analog connection. As organizations moved off physical servers and onto virtual servers, hardware-based fax boards were no longer compatible, so they were replaced with virtual SIP channels. But you still needed gateways or an on-site PBX to connect to the PSTN. With the introduction of SIP trunking and cloud telephony, there was no longer a need for any local hardware, including gateways or a local phone switch. It was now possible to use the internet to connect your organization to phone carriers who would provide your connection to the PSTN. These providers used encryption to secure your data and specialized fax over IP protocols to ensure reliability. Using SIP for your fax transmissions is not your only option. With the introduction of RightFax Connect, you now have another option. RightFax Connect is a hybrid cloud telephony solution that replaces traditional fax communication hardware and software like phone lines, fax boards, or SIP connections with a secure cloud-based fax transmission. Later in the presentation, we'll go into the details of RightFax Connect. Over the next few slides, we will go over different architectures you can use to connect your fax server when moving from on-premise to the cloud. There is no one-size-fits-all solution, and each architecture has different benefits and different requirements. When choosing a SIP provider, it is important to understand what protocol they use for transmitting a fax. A fax transmission is still a voice call, but it is not the same as a human's voice. Fax tones use a greater frequency and are more susceptible to errors. A human ear is much better at compensating for line errors during a call, so it's important to understand which protocol is best for fax. As you can see from the slide, the SIP protocol is always used to initiate, manage, and terminate the call. But once the call is established, different protocols must be used for the media stream to transmit their fax reliably. We always recommend T38. T38 was designed for fax. It uses less bandwidth, has built-in redundancy, and is much less susceptible to high latency, packet loss, and jitter. G711 can also be used for fax, but was designed for voice calls, so it's much more susceptible to line errors and uses more bandwidth. If your connection to your SIP carrier is very robust with very little latency and packet loss, G711 can be implemented successfully. Another popular voice protocol is G.729. G.729 is designed for human voice calls only and will not work for fax. No matter where you install your RightFax server, it still relies on PSTN connection to successfully complete a fax call. RightFax traffic must move through carriers and protocols like SIP and T38 to reach outside recipients. There are many options when configuring your connection to the PSTN. Without a fax-optimized telephony layer that is supported in the cloud, a successful cloud implementation cannot succeed. Over the next few slides, we'll go into different options available when making your decision on how to connect your fax server to the PSTN when moving to the cloud. So, why would you use a physical fax board? The only reason you would still use a physical fax board is if you were still running a physical fax server. Although most companies have migrated their physical service to virtual service, there is still some physical service being used. As you can see from the slide, the fax card is used so you can plug your analog or digital phone lines into your fax server and then create a connection to the PSTN. Using an on-premise fax server with a physical phone line can be very reliable, but it does lack redundancy and scalability. And once you decide to virtualize your fax server, you lose slots required for a physical fax board, so another solution is necessary. Since much of the world now runs virtual servers, there is no longer a slot available in a physical server to plug a fax card into. So now the fax card is replaced with virtual SIP channels. From the slide, you can see how a gateway is still needed since only the fax card was replaced, but not the analog or digital line. The gateway is used to connect the legacy analog or digital line to SIP channels so it can communicate with the fax server. The communication is all IP based, so it's communicating with the fax server by using its IP address. This kind of setup is still used since some organizations have virtualized their server infrastructure, but are still using analog or digital lines to connect to the PSTN. Although this configuration will work fine, it is not ideal since it doesn't provide redundancy or scalability. For example, if your T1 line goes down, you will lose the ability to send and receive faxes until it's up again. Another problem with this configuration is there is no easy way to add capacity. A T1 can handle up to 24 concurrent calls, and once all the lines are busy, no one can send or receive any faxes. Once you move your fax server to the cloud, not only do you lose the ability to install a fax card, but you also lose the ability to connect to an analog line, a T1 line, or a gateway. The purpose of the SIP carrier is to connect your fax server to the PSTN. Basically, you are using the internet to connect to the SIP carrier, and they connect you to the PSTN. No hardware is needed, and your faxes are transmitted in real time. A SIP carrier can provide a SIP connection directly to your fax server in any private or public cloud. Not all SIP providers will work properly when integrating with your fax server in the cloud. Some SIP carriers do not handle fax calls, some do not use standard ports and will not work through firewalls. Our certified team at Advantage can help you choose the proper SIP carrier for your cloud-based fax server. This slide is almost the same as the previous slide. The only difference is on this slide we are specifically talking about your fax server in either AWS or Azure. When moving your fax infrastructure to a public cloud such as AWS or Azure, you must consider additional things such as security, client access, and infrastructure. Firewalls are much more stringent in Azure and AWS, and you might not have the ability to open specific ports needed for fax over IP. It is imperative to choose a SIP carrier that is certified to work in Azure or AWS. Some SIP carriers will require you to run a session border controller when integrating with their SIP trunks. If that is the case, you can install a software-based SBC such as the Ribbon SWE Edge, and the good news is we have helped many of our customers install their SBC in the cloud. The other thing to consider is how your end users are going to connect to the fax server. In most cases, a site-to-site VPN is needed if you want to access all the features of your fax server, such as MFP integrations and EMR connections. RightFax Connect provides a flexible hybrid fax solution that combines the strength of your existing RightFax server with cloud-based telephony. It's secure, scalable, cost-effective, and removes the burden of managing physical fax infrastructure. Why would you use RightFax Connect rather than a SIP trunk? First, RightFax Connect does not use standard RightFax channel licenses, so your annual support will decrease. Second, RightFax Connect is fully scalable, and you only pay for what you use. As you need more fax capacity, it is available on demand, so your inbound fax calls never receive a busy signal. RightFax Connect is extremely reliable and uses multiple carriers and multiple paths to ensure your fax call completes successfully. RightFax Connect uses standard encrypted web ports, and since it initiates an outbound connection, no inbound firewall ports need to be opened. That is very important when installing RightFax in AWS or Azure. Throughout the presentation, I have been talking about the importance of choosing a SIP carrier that reliably supports fax transmissions. Advantage Technologies has been working with two SIP carriers for many years. Both Cloudly and T38 Fax built their SIP networks from the ground up to handle fax over IP. We have successfully implemented them in both AWS and Azure with no need to configure firewalls or do any custom configurations. They both have different approaches on how they handle encryption. Cloudly uses proprietary software to encrypt all fax traffic using standard outbound ports, so there is minimal firewall configuration needed. T38 Fax uses a site-to-site VPN to encrypt all fax traffic. They both use T38 protocol to ensure reliable fax transmissions, and they both support redundancy and multiple paths to ensure your fax completion rate is close to 100%. I can't stress how important it is to use a SIP carrier that is built for fax when planning your cloud strategy. We have heard many horror stories of customers trying to use a generic SIP carrier for their fax traffic, and almost all of them ended with failure. On this slide, we will go through the evolution from fully on-premise to pure cloud. So as I mentioned earlier, years ago, everything was on-premise: physical servers, physical T1 lines, physical analog lines. From there, we went to hybrid. What is hybrid? Hybrid would be a physical or virtual fax server with telecom in the cloud, such as RightFax Connect or a SIP trunk. So no need for T1s or analog lines, but again, you still have either a virtual or physical server. Next is private cloud. So private cloud we just talked about. That could be your own cloud, a data center where you put your fax server, where everything is now virtual, nothing is on-prem. You don't have T1 lines, analog lines, or even a fax server. Everything is up in a private cloud. Next would be hosted. That is where you take a RightFax server and move it to a third party to host it. Your connection to them might be a VPN, or maybe using standard web apps or web ports to connect. But again, you're hosted. Nothing is on-prem. You have no connections for T1s, analog, no SIP trunks. You're paying per page, all hosted. And finally, pure cloud. Pure cloud and hosted are similar. They're both in the cloud, but pure cloud would be something like fax to mail, mail to fax, where you're using a basic email interface to start a fax, receiving faxes into email, or in some cases, you're sharing a multi-tenant fax server. So you have some integrations, like you can still deliver faxes into email to a network folder, maybe even have MFP integrations, but you're connected to a fax system in the cloud that is not dedicated to your organization. They call that multi-tenant. That's the evolution from the beginning of on-premise physical to pure cloud. I think this slide speaks for itself. We have been fax experts for almost 30 years. Our US-based certified support team has won multiple awards, and your RightFax support through Advantage Technologies includes upgrades to the latest RightFax version and all patches. You also have access to the Advantage support portal, and we offer 24/7, 365-day-a-year critical support. Let's go through takeaways from today's presentation. First, no matter where you install your RightFax server, telephony still matters. Moving RightFax to the cloud is easy, including the connection to the PSTN, but you need to decide how you want to connect, and you have many options. Second, your fax server architecture will define which telephony option is best for your organization. And finally, let Advantage help you choose the right carriers and deployment model for a successful project.